Hi guys, I'm Tom and this is Watercolor Bites. These are easily digestible little hits of info to hopefully help you progress your painting. So let's roll the opener and take a look. If you haven't already, I definitely recommend hopping back to check out the previous videos in the series. They're kind of really paving the way for this and future episodes. In episode 1 we looked at some basic terms to get the ball rolling, and episode 2 we really got into the difference between tonal values and colour. Then episodes 3 and 4 have been a much deeper dive into tonal values, because for me these are the foundations of all painting, and we're going to continue to go even deeper in this episode. There's been loads of theory so far and not much painting. There is going to be a lot more painting as this series goes on, so kind of stick with me. These early ones are really laying down the groundwork for future videos to hopefully make a little bit more sense, and we will be revisiting a lot of these topics as we go on throughout. We left off the last video looking at using only 3 tones to really simplify our subject right down, at least while we're analysing it and trying to translate it into a painting. So we saw that with just 3 values, a light, a dark and a mid-tone, when used as a nice strong pattern of light and shadow, they can create a really impactful and very readable work of art that can have a surprising amount of light, form and depth, and even a good sense of realism. But as we look to refine our paintings and kind of take them further and up to the next level, I really find this a useful approach, looking at balancing simplification with enough information to make it an interesting, a complete piece. That information being subtlety, a feeling of form, depth and space, and of course details. With simplicity born out of focusing on simple patterns of light and shadow to create strong design and good compositions. And this balance for me comes down to 4 basic underlying tonal values which we're going to look at. In turn, these values are born out of looking for 2 values in the light section and 2 in the shadow section of any given object or scene, and plus there's 2 potentially extra values which we'll get onto. To really understand this, let's look at light and the way that it hits a 3D object. The only 2 things I could find were this plastic tomato and a wooden egg with a face on it. Let's go with the egg. So our light source is coming from here, the top left corner. And this is creating a very clear and distinct light side and shadow side. Let's look at the light side first. So if we squint or blur our eyes and we ignore the bright highlight, there is a kind of dominant overriding tonal value, and we can call this the average light. Now of course the average light value will vary depending on the subject and the lighting setting, but it is effectively the average of all of the tonal values within the light area, and a great way to look at simplifying our subject as always. Now within this light area there are of course some smaller areas that are lighter. For example, this area here, which is the plane most directly facing the light source, called the center light, not to be confused with the highlight, which is a direct reflection of the light source. Then still on the light side we have the halftones, which begin where the shadow stops, and this is also known as the Terminator. Halftones get progressively lighter as they move around the planes of the form towards the light, and we can have a whole myriad of lots of different halftones, and it can be where the real subtlety of a subject is found, and it is certainly where the real subtlety and refinement of creating a painting can lie, although because of this it can also be the area where we are most likely to run into trouble. Loads more on halftones to come. Next, let's look at the shadow side. So of course the shadow side is not just black. Even in this very high contrast example where the shadows are actually very dark, even in this we still see that there are some lighter areas within the shadows. This is because light bounces off things and it will bounce back into the shadow areas, and we have seen already that the light side is influenced directly but not exclusively by the light source, whereas the shadow side is lit by what is called ambient light. Also known as reflected or bounce light, this light entering the shadow areas, every time it bounces off something it loses power, and therefore the bounce light does illuminate objects in shadow, but in a much more soft and gentle way. And the ambient light varies hugely and is dependent on many factors, one of the main ones being what other objects are around it and how close those objects are. For example, if I hold up this card at the back of the egg, look how instantly the tonal values in the shadow areas change. So to stay in keeping with the light side, let's look for some of these basic tonal values. So whilst analysing this, again I would squint or blur my eyes to simplify the tonal values, and I would say that there is this tone here, which has plenty of variation in it, but I would call it the dominant or overriding shadow value, or the average shadow. And then we have the slightly lighter area due to the reflected light. And of course, again, there are many subtle variations, but the aim is to simplify, simplify, simplify. And a little bit like I ignored the highlight in the light side, I'm also ignoring to some extent the very dark area here in the core shadow. Which is very prominent here because the bounce light is so strong, and I'm also ignoring the very, very deep dark shadow directly under the egg. Now this is known as the ambient occlusion, sometimes called the occlusion shadow, and these are the deep crevices or recesses where very little, if any, light can actually reach, making them very, very dark. And notice how the cast shadow from the egg gets slightly lighter as it moves away from the egg itself. It's subtle in this case, but this is because more light is able to enter this part of the shadow, and this phenomena is often much more noticeable than in this example. Now let's swing all this theory back round towards a distilled down and applicable version. Egg into grayscale, go! So the light side, we've got lots of choices of the light tone here, from the centre light to any of the myriad of lighter halftones, but to simplify we're going to blur our eyes and we're simply going to look for the average light value. And on the other side, again, we have lots of choices, from the core shadows to the ambient occlusion to the reflected light, but we're going to blur our eyes or squint and pick out an average shadow value. Then rather than get bogged down in it, we're going to pick just one halftone. Ideally it's fairly close in value to the average light, and there's more on grouping tonal values in the next video. And then finally we're going to pick out a nice simple value to represent the ambient or bounce light. And so there we have our 4 basic tones that I'm looking for in any subject. And what's lovely about this is we then have just enough room to stretch our tonal range to include a bright highlight, and if we want it, a nice deep dark or a dark accent. As we saw, this may be just simply wanting to stretch the tonal values in a shadow area like the core shadow, or it might be used to represent the ambient occlusion or the ambient shadows where very little light is getting into an area. And please remember that whilst these are very widely used basic principles, I'm just trying to explain how I like to use them, and there are of course lots of variations on these themes and different ways to interpret them, and not forgetting of course that these are just examples of actual values that are relevant to this egg. I am not saying that these are the specific values to be used in every subject. So let's wrap this video up by looking at the theory in context. We're back to the elephant. I promise it won't always be colourful elephants, it's just to give a bit of continuity for now, and we're going to flip him into grayscale. Sorry He-Man, that's still a no. Looking at just the elephant itself, let's kick off with the dominant or average light tone. And in this case I've used some left whites of the page to represent the highlights or the very bright lights. Next, let's take this value here, and this is where we can see that this way of thinking about our subject is actually fluid and changeable to suit. It doesn't have to be as rigid as we've just looked at. The bottom line is that we are using it to simplify our values, and here it is used to really simplify the subject from a tonal point of view. So this value is very much the dominant or average shadow. You can see it everywhere in the shadows. And in this case it actually represents in some places the reflected light, and in other places it simply is just an area that has been cast into shadow, like this leg here or the underside here. And now we have the halftone, which we've simplified to be just one value in this case, or more accurately a very, very small range of values that give the more subtle feeling of shape and form within those light areas. And then very finally we have those much darker tones, and in this case they really are a dark accent to push the overall contrast, but also they give an extra dimension and depth to those shadow areas. So that's it guys, I hope it made some sort of sense. Just a little end note to say that everything I've been talking about here is a way to conceptualize our subject. It's one of a few ways that really works for me, and whilst it is also a really useful way to actually go about creating a painting, I am in no way saying that you have to paint like this or like I do. I'm more trying to show some basic principles and their uses, and also show my thought process whilst looking at the subject and whilst painting. And this is in the hope that you can take this to your own painting, whatever your style or your favourite subject. And I've found these tools to be incredibly useful, and by trying to find and apply them in a wide range of subjects, they've really moved my own painting forward quite significantly, and I am constantly learning and relearning this stuff on a deeper and deeper level. And I've got a long way to go myself, but as I keep saying, simply being aware of these principles and slowly trying to apply them bit by bit will do nothing but good for your painting. So I'm going to be talking about another way to conceptualize our subject in the next video, and then really look at this in practical painting terms, followed by finally looking at some actual painting. Don't forget you can see more in-depth tutorials and full-length painting, plus loads of other exclusive content over on my Patreon page. The link is in the description below, and if you know anyone you think might enjoy this video, please do feel free to share. Until next time guys, happy living, happy creating, and I will catch you in the next video.